You think you have a choice, Lisa. Beatrice's voice was a soft, venomous hiss in the grand foyer. You broke the heirloom. You offended the visiting emissary. Your defiance ends tonight. Lisa stood rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the banister. It was an accident, and you know it. Accidents have consequences, Beatrice replied, her smile not reaching her cold eyes. The Alpha King demands a tribute from our pact to seal the new treaty, a sign of our absolute submission. She stepped closer, the scent of expensive perfume sickeningly sweet. He is known to be difficult, brutal, they say, and he specifically requested someone from the main line. Beatrice signaled the guards. Take her to the border. Let King David deal with her now. The journey to the Shadow Pact territory was a blur of frantic heartbeat and suffocating dread. Lisa sat in the back of the armored SUV, the tinted windows offering only distorted glimpses of the passing landscape. The vibrant greens of her home pack, the sun ridge slowly bled into deep, imposing evergreens. The air grew perceptibly colder, heavier. This was the domain of Alpha King David, a man whose name was whispered to children as a cautionary tale. Beatrice's words echoed in Lisa's mind. Tribute, submission, brutal. Lisa wasn't naive. She understood pack politics. The Sunridge Pack was weak, their economy failing, their defenses porous. The Shadow Pack, under David's ruthless expansion, was an empire. This treaty was their only salvation, and Beatrice, her father's ambitious second wife, had found the perfect way to secure it while simultaneously discarding the unwanted stepdaughter. The broken heirloom was merely a convenient excuse, a staged accident to justify this ultimate punishment. The SUV ground to a halt before massive iron gates, wrought with jagged patterns that looked like stylized fangs. The guards up front, men loyal only to Beatrice, exchanged tense glances. Even they feared this place. The gates groaned open, revealing a fortress carved into the side of a mountain. It wasn't the opulent, sunlit estate she was used to, but a monument to power and pragmatism. Stone, steel, and shadow. She was ushered inside by silent sentinels whose eyes held no warmth, only sharp assessment. They led her through labyrinthine corridors, the sound of her own footsteps echoing mockingly. The air was thick with a metallic tang, not blood, but the sharp ozone scent of raw, suppressed power. They stopped before a set of imposing double doors. The head guard, a man with a scar jagged across his cheek, finally spoke. The king awaits. He didn't open the door for her. He merely stepped aside. Lisa took a shuddering breath. She smoothed down the simple, almost threadbare dress Beatrice had forced her to wear. A final humiliation designed to make her look like a beggar, not an alpha's daughter. She pushed the doors open. The room was vast, dominated by a massive stone hearth where a fire roared, casting long, dancing shadows. But the heat of the fire was nothing compared to the intensity that hit her the moment she stepped inside. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out over the dark expanse of his territory. King David. He was taller than she imagined, broad-shouldered and imposing, radiating an aura of sheer dominance that made her wolf whimper and bare its neck in submission, even before he turned. When he did, Lisa felt the air leave her lungs. He wasn't a monster, not physically. He was starkly handsome, with harsh, aristocratic features carved from granite. But it was his eyes that terrified her, a deep, piercing gold that seemed to strip away her skin and examine her very soul. They were cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. So, his voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in her chest. The Sunridge Pack sends its troublesome princess as a peace offering. He began to walk toward her, his movements fluid, predatory. He circled her slowly, his gaze sweeping over her meager dress, her trembling hands, her defiant chin. Your stepmother sent a very detailed letter regarding your transgressions, he murmured, pausing right behind her. She could feel the heat radiating from him. Insubordination, destruction of property, a general lack of respect for authority. Lisa forced herself to speak, though her voice shook. She lied, David chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. Everyone lies, Lisa. The question is, which lie is more useful to me? He stepped in front of her again, forcing her to look up at him. You are here as punishment. Do you understand what that means in my pack? It means my life is forfeit, she whispered, the reality crashing down on her. Your old life, yes. David corrected softly, his golden eyes narrowing. Here. You will learn obedience. You will learn your place. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently catching a stray lock of her hair. The touch was terrifyingly gentle against the threat in his words. And we will see if the fire in your eyes can be tamed, or if it must be extinguished. Lisa's new reality was a disorienting paradox. She was a prisoner, yet she wasn't thrown into a dungeon. Instead, she was given a suite of rooms high in the fortress, luxurious but stark, devoid of any personal touches. The windows were reinforced glass, offering a sweeping view of a territory she couldn't touch. Her days were rigidly structured. She was assigned a silent, efficient maid named Alara, who brought her meals, drew her baths, and laid out austere, dark-colored clothing. She was allowed to walk the designated inner gardens, but always under the watchful eyes of the Shadow Pack guards. It was isolation masked as hospitality, a psychological cage. King David was a ghost in her daily life, yet his presence permeated everything. She felt him in the sharp, disciplined movements of the staff, in the hushed tones of conversations that stopped when she approached. He was the sun this dark system revolved around. A week passed before she saw him again. She was in the library, a massive, multi-level room filled with ancient tomes and modern texts. It was the only place she found solace, burying herself in history and strategy, anything to keep her mind from the terrifying uncertainty of her fate. She was reaching for a book on a high shelf when a hand appeared above hers, effortlessly plucking the heavy volume down. The History of the Northern Alliances. David's voice rumbled close to her ear. Heavy reading for a captive. Lisa spun around, clutching the book to her chest. He was dressed in dark training gear, a light sheen of sweat on his brow, smelling of pine and exertion. I prefer it to dwelling on my circumstances, Your Majesty, she said, trying to keep her tone level. David, he corrected, leaning against the bookshelf, watching her intently. In this room, it's just David. She blinked, confused by the sudden informality. I don't think my stepmother sent me here for casual reading sessions. Your stepmother, David said, his lip curling in distaste, is a fool who thinks she can buy my favor with a pawn. She underestimated both of us, it seems. How so? She thought you were broken, a nuisance to be discarded. He stepped closer, the predatory aura returning. But this time, it was laced with something else. Curiosity. But I've been watching you, Lisa. You don't weep. You don't beg. You read military history and glare at my guards as if you're calculating their weak points. Lisa felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. She hadn't realized she was so transparent. I am merely trying to survive. Survival is base instinct, David murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. I am interested in what comes after you realize you're going to survive. He took the book from her rigid grip and placed it back on the shelf. Dinner. Tonight, my private quarters. It wasn't a request. That evening, Alara arrived with a dress unlike the austere garments she'd been given so far. It was deep forest green, simple but elegantly cut, flowing silk that clung to her subtle curves. When the guards escorted her to David's quarters, her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The room was surprisingly Spartan, lacking the ostentatious display of wealth common to alphas. A large oak table was set for two near a roaring fire. David stood as she entered, his eyes darkening as they swept over her. For a fleeting second, the cold alpha king vanished, replaced by a man looking at a woman. Then, the mask snapped back into place. The meal was a tense affair. The food was exquisite, but Lisa could barely taste it. David ate with precise, controlled movements, asking sharp, probing questions about the Sunridge Pack, her father's declining health, and Beatrice's political maneuverings. He was interrogating her, testing her intelligence and her loyalty. You speak of your pack with a strange detachment, he noted, swirling the blood-red wine in his glass. They detached themselves from me the moment they handed me to you, Lisa replied, the bitterness leaking through her carefully constructed, neutral tone. David stopped, his glass pausing halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. Treachery from within is the deepest wound, he said, his voice surprisingly soft. It teaches you to trust no one. Is that why you are so feared? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of weariness beneath the gold. Fear is a useful tool. Love is a liability. And what am I doing here, David? She challenged, leaning forward slightly. If I am not a pawn, and I am not to be trusted, what is my purpose? He stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched until it felt fragile, ready to shatter. Your purpose, he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, is yet to be determined. The following weeks established a strange rhythm. The overt threat of punishment faded, replaced by an intense, unspoken scrutiny. David continued to summon her for dinners, and occasionally he would find her in the gardens or the library. Their conversations were like fencing matches, quick thrusts of interrogation parried by careful deflection. Yet, amidst the verbal sparring, a strange intellectual intimacy began to form. He challenged her mind, and she, surprisingly, found herself challenging his. She learned that the stories of his brutality were true, but incomplete. He was ruthless to his enemies and unforgiving of betrayal, but he was fiercely protective of his own pack. The Shadow moniker wasn't just about stealth. It was about sheltering his people from the harshness of the world under his massive, unyielding canopy. One crisp afternoon, Lisa was in the training courtyard. She had finally managed to convince Alara to procure some basic workout clothes. She needed to move, to burn off the suffocating tension that coiled tighter within her every day. She was working on a heavy bag, throwing punches with a ferocity born of frustration. She didn't hear him approach until his voice cut through the rhythmic thud of her strikes. Your stance is too wide. You're sacrificing speed for power. But a faster opponent will exploit that gap. Lisa stopped, panting, pushing a damp strand of hair from her face. David was standing by the equipment rack, dressed casually, watching her with a critical eye. "I wasn't aware I was preparing for a duel," she shot back, annoyed at the interruption. "You should always be prepared," he countered, walking toward her. "In my territory, weakness is an invitation." He stopped beside the heavy bag. "Show me." Lisa hesitated, then fell back into her stance. She threw a combination, trying to tighten her footwork. "Better," he murmured, "but still too rigid." Before she could react, he stepped into her space. He didn't hit her, but he moved with terrifying speed, lightly tapping her shoulder, her ribs, her hip, demonstrating every opening she left exposed. "You fight like someone who expects to be hit," he said, his voice low, his proximity making her breath hitch. "You need to fight like someone who intends to win." He adjusted her shoulders, his hands warm and firm through the thin fabric of her shirt. A jolt of electricity shot through her at his touch. She froze, her wolf suddenly hyper-aware of the dominant male so close. "Relax," he commanded softly, though she could feel the tension humming in his own frame. He moved behind her, his chest brushing her back as he guided her arms through a defensive block. "Like this," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair at the nape of her neck. "Use their momentum against them." Lisa couldn't focus on the technique. The scent of him, pine, leather, and that raw masculine power, was intoxicating. She felt a dangerous heat pooling in her belly, a response that horrified her. This was the man holding her captive, the man who could end her life on a whim. She spun around suddenly, breaking his hold, putting distance between them. Her chest heaved. "I think that's enough for today," she said, her voice unsteady. David watched her, his golden eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't move toward her, but the air between them crackled with suppressed energy. "You're afraid," he stated, a factual observation. "Of course I am," she snapped, anger masking the confusing flutter in her chest. "You are the Alpha King. You can do whatever you want with me." "And what do you think I want to do with you, Lisa?" he asked, taking a slow step forward. The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. The stories of his cruelty warred with the gentle way he'd just touched her, the intellectual respect he showed her, the sudden, intense burning in his gaze. "I don't know," she whispered truthfully. He stopped just inches from her. He reached out, slowly this time, and cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, a gesture so tender it felt like a physical blow. "Neither do I," he confessed, the admission ripped from him. "And that little wolf is what terrifies me." He dropped his hand and walked away, leaving Lisa standing in the courtyard, her heart pounding a frantic drumbeat against the silence he left behind. The dynamic had shifted. The punishment had somehow morphed into a dangerous, unpredictable game, and she realized with a jolt of panic that she was no longer sure who was the captive and who was the captor. The uneasy truce between Lisa and her captor was shattered 3 days later by the arrival of an uninvited guest. Lisa was in her quarters, tracing the frost patterns on the reinforced glass of her window, when Alara slipped into the room. The maid's usually placid expression was tight, her movements clipped. "You are to dress for a formal dinner, my lady," Alara said, laying a garment bag on the bed. "An emissary from the Sunridge Pack has arrived." Lisa's blood ran cold. The Sunridge Pack. Beatrice. She turned from the window, her pulse drumming a frantic beat against her throat. "Who is it?" "A man named Silas," Alara replied, unzipping the bag. He claims he brings an addendum to the treaty. Silas, Beatrice's right-hand man, a sycophant whose loyalty was bought with stolen pact funds and empty promises of power. He was the one who had dragged Lisa from her bed the night she was banished. Panic, sharp and metallic, flared in her chest, but she ruthlessly shoved it down. She would not cower. Not here, not anymore. The dress Ilara had brought was a masterpiece of intimidation. It was midnight blue, tailored to fit like a second skin, with long sleeves and a high neckline that offered no vulnerability, yet commanded absolute attention. It was a stark contrast to the beggar's rags Beatrice had sent her in. It was armor. When the guards escorted her into the great hall, the heavy oak doors groaned, announcing her arrival. The room was grand, lit by hundreds of floating candles that cast flickering golden light over the long, polished dining table. David sat at the head, a picture of lethal composure in a tailored black suit that did nothing to hide the broad, heavily muscled lines of his body. Silas sat halfway down the table, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the vast, shadowed space. Silas's head snapped up as Lisa entered. A smug, oily smile spread across his thin lips, undoubtedly expecting to see her broken, starved, or chained. Instead, his smile faltered as she glided toward the table, her spine steel, her chin held high. "Ah, Lisa," Silas drawled, recovering his composure. He didn't stand. "Look at you. I see the Shadow Pack is charitable to its prisoners." David didn't speak. He merely watched, his golden eyes resting on Lisa with an unreadable, heavy weight. He gestured to the empty chair to his immediate right. Not the foot of the table, his right hand. Lisa took the seat, feeling the ambient heat radiating from David's massive frame. "I am not a prisoner, Silas," Lisa said smoothly, pouring herself a glass of water. Her hand didn't tremble. "I am a guest." Silas barked a harsh laugh, looking to David for camaraderie. "A guest? Come now, King David. We both know why she was sent here. Beatrice hopes she hasn't been too much of a burden. She was always a willful, disobedient child. If you require a more compliant tribute, Sunridge is willing to negotiate." The silence that followed was absolute. The clinking of silverware stopped. Even the guards by the doors seemed to stop breathing. David slowly turned his head toward Silas. The movement was predatory, like a great cat locking onto a wounded gazelle. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "You presume to speak of burdens in my hall?" David's voice was a low, vibrating purr that made the silverware rattle subtly against the table. Silas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I merely meant, Your Majesty, that Beatrice..." David cut him off, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. "Sent me a woman she deemed worthless, a woman she accused of treason and destruction." David leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table, his massive hands clasping together. He didn't look at Lisa, but she could feel the tether of his awareness wrapped tightly around her. Yet, in the weeks she has been here, I have found no treason, only intellect. David continued, his gaze pinning Silas to his chair. "I have found no destruction, only resilience. It makes me question the judgment of the Sunridge leadership. It makes me wonder if the tribute was not a punishment for her, but a profound miscalculation by you." Silas was pale, sweating profusely. "Your Majesty, the heirloom she destroyed was a piece of glass." David snarled, his alpha aura suddenly flaring, a suffocating physical weight that pressed down on the room. Silas whimpered, physically shrinking back. Lisa gripped the edge of the table, her breath hitching. She had known David was powerful, but this raw, unfiltered dominance was terrifying. Yet, miraculously, the crushing weight of his aura bypassed her entirely. He was shielding her from it. "You will return to Sunridge at first light," David commanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You will tell Beatrice that the treaty stands, but you will also tell her this. Lisa is under my protection. She is of the Shadow Pact now. If Sunridge, or anyone else, attempts to use her as a pawn again, I will not send an emissary. I will bring my army." Silas nodded frantically, scraping his chair back and practically fleeing the hall, leaving his dinner untouched. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him. The oppressive aura vanished in an instant, leaving the room strangely quiet. Lisa sat frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at David. He was staring into his wine glass, his jaw tight. "Why did you do that?" she whispered, the tremor finally reaching her voice. David slowly turned to look at her. The cold, ruthless alpha was gone. In his eyes, the gold burned with a fierce, undeniable heat. "Because," he said softly, reaching out to trace the knuckles of her white-knuckled grip on the table, "they do not get to dictate your worth, and I protect what is mine." The fortress felt different after Silas's departure. The invisible boundaries that had defined Lisa's captivity had dissolved, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. David had claimed her as his own in front of a foreign emissary. "I protect what is mine." The words echoed in her mind relentlessly. Sleep was impossible. A late autumn storm was battering the mountain, hurling sheets of rain against her reinforced windows. The barometric drop made her wolf restless, pacing beneath her skin. Needing distraction, Lisa slipped a heavy woolen shawl over her nightgown and stepped out into the dark, silent corridors. Her feet carried her instinctively toward the library. It was the one place where the ghosts of the fortress seemed quiet. The library was dark, save for the violent flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the massive spines of the ancient books. Lisa navigated by memory, heading for the history section. As she rounded a towering oak bookshelf, she stopped short. A single reading lamp cast a warm pool of light over a heavy mahogany desk. David was there. He sat slumped back in a leather armchair, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, his collar undone. In the dim light, he looked haggard, the sharp angles of his face softened by exhaustion. He didn't move as she approached, though she knew he had heard her. "The storm is keeping you awake too," he murmured, his voice rougher, deeper in the quiet of the night. "My wolf hates the thunder," Lisa replied softly, stepping into the edge of the lamplight. David let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. "It's not the thunder. It's the change in pressure. It makes us feel trapped. Instinct demands we run, but logic tells us to seek shelter." He finally looked at her. His eyes, usually a piercing, calculating gold, were muted, heavy with a shadow she hadn't seen before. He looked down at the tumbler in his hand. "Silas brought news, didn't he?" Lisa asked, sensing the source of his dark mood. Beyond Beatrice's petty demands. David was silent for a long moment. A crack of thunder shook the floorboards beneath them. "He brought rumors," David finally said, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Whispers from the borderlands, remnants of the old pacts, the ones I conquered to build this territory, are organizing. They call me a tyrant, a monster who steals daughters and slaughters alphas. Are they right? Lisa asked. The question hung in the air, audacious and terrifying. David's gaze snapped to hers. He set the glass down with a heavy thud. He didn't look angry. He looked weary. When I took over the Shadow Pack, it wasn't a pack. It was a graveyard, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. My father was weak. He allowed neighboring alphas to raid our lands, take our food, slaughter our sick. I watched my mother bleed out on the snow because an invading pack wanted our hunting grounds. Lisa inhaled sharply, clutching her shawl tighter. Beatrice's cruelty paled in comparison to the brutal reality of David's past. I didn't conquer them out of greed, Lisa. David continued, standing slowly. He moved around the desk, stopping just a foot away from her. The scent of him, petrichor, whiskey, and raw power, enveloped her. I conquered them to build a wall. I became the monster they whispered about, so that my people would never have to look over their shoulders again. I ruled by fear, because fear is the only language those beasts understood. He reached out, his large hands hovering just inches from her arms, as if he wanted to touch her, but didn't trust himself. But you, he whispered, his eyes searching her face, cataloging every nuance of her expression. You look at me, and you don't see the monster, even when you should, even when I give you every reason to. I see a man, Lisa said, her voice trembling. A man who carries the weight of a kingdom alone. David closed the remaining distance between them. He rested his forehead against hers. The contact was electric, sending a jolt of heat straight to her core. He was so large, so overpowering. Yet his touch was profoundly gentle. It is a lonely weight, he confessed, his breath mingling with hers. I thought I was accustomed to the dark, until you walked into my hall with fire in your eyes and defied me. Lisa looked up, their lips bare inches apart. She could feel the erratic thumping of his heart echoing the frantic rhythm of her own. The air between them was thick, suffocating with unsaid things. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her mouth. A sharp, shrill siren shattered the intimacy. David violently pulled back, his head snapping toward the window. The perimeter alarm, the vulnerability vanished from his face in an instant, replaced by the lethal, calculating Alpha King. The monster had returned to defend his walls. Stay here, he ordered, his voice cold iron. Do not leave this room. But before she could argue, he was gone, swallowing the darkness as he sprinted down the corridor, leaving Lisa alone with the echoing siren and the phantom warmth of his touch on her skin. The siren wailed, a mechanical shriek that cut through the thunder. Lisa stood frozen in the library for exactly 10 seconds before the adrenaline overrode David's command. Stay here. It was a sensible order. She was weaponless and untrained for real combat. But the thought of cowering in the dark, while the man who had just bared his soul to her ran into danger, made her stomach violently rebel. She ran to the nearest window. The courtyard below was a chaos of motion. Shadow Pack warriors, moving with terrifying, silent efficiency, were pouring out of the barracks. Floodlights slashed through the driving rain, illuminating the massive iron gates. They weren't just under attack, they had been breached. Lisa squinted through the rain-streaked glass. The attackers weren't organized soldiers. They moved erratically, shifting mid-stride between human and wolf forms. Rogues, feral, unpredictable, and entirely devoid of pack law. Suddenly, her eyes caught movement away from the main skirmish. 3 rogues, fully shifted into massive, mangy wolves, had bypassed the courtyard slaughter. They were scaling the rough stone of the eastern wall, the wall that led directly to the upper residential wing, to her wing. Lisa didn't think. She bolted from the library, sprinting down the corridor toward her quarters. If they made it inside, they would slaughter the unarmed staff. Alara was down there. She reached the intersection near her rooms just as the heavy glass of the eastern balcony doors shattered inward. A rogue wolf scrambled through the broken frame, shaking glass and rain from its matted fur. It was hideous. Emaciated, eyes wild with bloodlust and madness. It sniffed the air, its gaze locking onto Lisa. It snarled, exposing yellowed, rotting fangs. Lisa's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind went eerily calm. David's words from the training yard echoed in her head. You fight like someone who expects to be hit. You need to fight like someone who intends to win. She didn't retreat. She grabbed a heavy iron candelabra from the hall table, gripping it like a bat. The rogue lunged. It was fast, a blur of fur and claws. Lisa dropped to one knee, using its own momentum against it, just as David had taught her. She swung the heavy iron base upward with all her strength, catching the wolf squarely under its jaw. Bone crunched. The rogue yelped, its trajectory thrown off. It crashed into the stone wall, sliding down in a stunned heap. But there were two more. The second wolf squeezed through the broken frame, immediately lunging for her before she could recover her stance. Its jaws snapped inches from her face, foul breath washing over her. Lisa scrambled backward, using the candelabra to parry a swipe of its claws, but the force of the blow knocked the makeshift weapon from her hands. She was cornered. The wolf crouched, muscles coiling for the killing strike. A roar shook the very foundation of the fortress. It wasn't a sound a human throat could make. It was a primordial, earth-shattering sound of absolute fury. A massive shape erupted from the stairwell behind the wolf. It was David, fully shifted. His wolf form was terrifying, a nightmare of midnight fur, muscles like steel cables, and eyes that glowed with demonic gold fire. He dwarfed the rogue entirely. David didn't just attack the rogue, he annihilated it. His jaws locked onto the back of the rogue's neck, and with a sickening crunch and a vicious shake of his massive head, it was over. He tossed the lifeless body aside like a broken toy. The third rogue, halfway through the window, took one look at the Alpha King and tried to flee. David moved with impossible speed, a black blur that intercepted the fleeing wolf, dragging it back out onto the balcony into the rain. The sounds that followed were wet, brutal, and mercifully brief. Lisa leaned against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor, her chest heaving, her hands shaking violently now that the adrenaline was fading. Silence descended on the corridor, broken only by the howling wind outside. A shadow fell over her. David had shifted back. He was kneeling in front of her, entirely naked, oblivious to the cold, the rain, or the blood staining his chest and arms. His human eyes were still flashing with his wolf's golden fury. He reached out, his hands trembling, the first time she had ever seen him unsteady. He grabbed her arms, pulling her firmly into his chest. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a harsh, ragged grate. He was checking her over frantically, his hands running over her shoulders, her neck, searching for wounds. "Tell me you're not hurt." "I'm okay," Lisa gasped, burying her face in the crook of his neck. He smelled of rain, blood, and sheer terror. "I'm okay, I hit it." David crushed her against him, burying his face in her hair. He was breathing hard, his massive chest heaving against hers. "I told you to stay in the library." He growled into her hair. But there was no anger in his tone, only desperate, raw panic. I felt them breach the east wall. I thought I was too late. He pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were wide, the iron mask of the Alpha King completely shattered. In that moment, he wasn't a king, and she wasn't a captive. "Don't you ever do that again," he whispered fiercely, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "Don't you ever put yourself in danger. I won't cower while you fight." Lisa defied him softly, her hands instinctively coming up to rest on his blood-slicked chest. David stared at her, a profound realization dawning in his golden eyes. The fear of losing her had stripped away the last of his defenses. "You are going to be the death of me, Lisa," he breathed. And then, surrounded by shattered glass and the bodies of his enemies, the feared Alpha King leaned down and captured her lips with his own. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and possessive. A fiery claim that branded her soul and sealed her fate irrevocably to his. The courtyard was a scene of grim efficiency the next morning. The rain had washed away the worst of the carnage, but the scent of blood and wet ash clung to the damp stones. Shadow Pack warriors moved with quiet purpose, securing the breached wall and removing the bodies of the rogue wolves. Lisa stood by the window of her quarters, the heavy velvet drapes pulled back. She had barely slept. The memory of David's kiss, the frantic, bruising heat of it, was branded onto her lips, a constant, echoing pulse that made her restless. A quiet knock drew her attention. The heavy oak door swung open, and David stepped inside. He looked exhausted. The feral Alpha King who had slaughtered rogues in the rain was gone, replaced by a man wearing the heavy mantle of leadership. He wore a simple dark sweater and trousers, but he moved with a stiffness that suggested hidden injuries. "The perimeter is secure," he said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't move past the threshold, keeping a careful distance between them. The breach was targeted. They knew exactly where to hit the wall to access the residential wing. Lisa turned from the window, her arms crossed over her chest. The air between them crackled with the unresolved tension of the night before. "You think someone gave them the blueprints?" "I know someone did," David replied, his golden eyes hardening. "Rogues don't coordinate complex sieges. They are scavengers. Someone paid them, armed them with information, and pointed them at my fortress." "Who?" Lisa asked, though a cold dread was already pooling in her stomach. David finally stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. "We found a scent marker on one of the bodies, a specific blend of wolfsbane and silver trace. It's a signature." "Whose?" "It's not from the borderlands, Lisa," David said softly, watching her face closely. "It's from the south, the Sunridge territory." Lisa felt the blood drain from her face. She swayed slightly, and David immediately stepped forward, his hand hovering near her elbow. But he didn't touch her. "Beatrice," she breathed, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. "She wouldn't. She knows you would retaliate. She knows I would retaliate if she attacked openly," David corrected, his tone analytical but thrumming with underlying anger. "Using rogues gives her plausible deniability. If they succeeded, I would be distracted by internal security, and you would be dead. A tragic casualty of a rogue attack." The reality of it settled over Lisa like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Beatrice hadn't just banished her. She was actively trying to eliminate her. The treaty was a ruse to buy time, and Lisa was the sacrificial lamb meant to draw David's fire. "Why?" Lisa whispered, staring blindly at the floor. "I was no threat to her. I have no claim to the Sunridge leadership. Why go to such lengths? Because you are not just a prisoner anymore, Lisa, David said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that forced her to look up. He closed the remaining distance between them. The exhaustion in his eyes was eclipsed by a fierce, possessive heat. He reached out, his knuckles brushing against her cheek, the touch shockingly gentle compared to the violence he was capable of. When Silas reported back, he didn't just tell her that I refused to negotiate. David continued, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He told her that I claimed you, that I protected you. You were supposed to be a broken tribute, a symbol of my dominance over Sunridge. Instead, you have become something else entirely. What have I become? She asked, her breath hitching as he stepped closer, the warmth of his body seeping into hers. A vulnerability, David admitted, the words sounding like a confession torn from him. He rested his forehead against hers, a mirror of their moment in the library. But the stakes were infinitely higher now. You are the one thing Beatrice believes she can use to hurt me. She thinks if she strikes you, she strikes my heart. Lisa's heart hammered against her ribs. He hadn't said the words, but the implication was clear, earth-shattering in its weight. The feared Alpha King, the monster of the North, was admitting that a discarded tribute had become his weakness. I won't be a pawn, Lisa said fiercely, gripping the front of his sweater. Not for her and not for you. David let out a breathy laugh, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. The golden fire in his gaze was blinding. No, little wolf. You could never be a pawn. You are the queen on the board, and it's time we started playing to win. The shift in David was immediate and terrifying. The weary leader vanished, replaced by the strategic mastermind who had conquered the northern territories. He summoned his war council, a group of scarred, grim-faced alphas who looked at Lisa with a mixture of wariness and newfound respect when David insisted she remain in the room. They gathered around a massive oak table in the war room, a map of the continent spread out before them. Beatrice thinks she can wage a shadow war while hiding behind the treaty. David began, his voice commanding absolute silence. He slammed a heavy iron dagger into the map, the blade piercing the territory marked as Sunridge. We are going to disabuse her of that notion. An open attack on Sunridge violates the treaty, sire. General Kale, a massive wolf with a silver-streaked beard, pointed out cautiously. The neighboring packs might see it as unprovoked aggression. We could face a coalition. It won't be an unprovoked attack, David said, a cruel, calculating smile playing on his lips. He looked at Lisa, his eyes burning with a strange, dark pride. It will be a reclamation. He turned back to the council. Beatrice sent Lisa here as a tribute, forfeiting her rights as a Sunridge citizen. But she miscalculated. By pack law, if a tribute is accepted and claimed by the receiving alpha, they become a full member of that pack. An attack on Lisa is an attack on the Shadow Pack. The council members exchanged startled glances. Kyle cleared his throat. Sire, you haven't formally claimed her. There has been no ceremony, no marking. There will be, David said softly, his gaze never leaving Lisa. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing hot and tight. But the legal precedent is established by my public declaration to Silas. We have proof of the rogue attack, and we have the scent markers linking them to Sunridge. He leaned over the table, his physical presence dominating the space. We do not march on Sunridge to conquer. We march to arrest a traitor who attempted to assassinate a member of my pack. The strategy was brilliant. It bypassed the treaty entirely, framing the conflict not as a war of expansion, but as a matter of internal pack justice. It isolated Beatrice, forcing the Sunridge warriors to choose between defending a corrupt leader or yielding to a lawful arrest. The fortress transformed into a war machine. For 3 days, the air hummed with the sound of sharpening steel, the heavy thud of marching boots, and the low, tense growls of wolves preparing for a hunt. Lisa found herself swept up in the current. She wasn't relegated to the sidelines. David kept her close, consulting her on the layout of the Sunridge estate, the likely loyalties of the guard captains, and the hidden passages within her former home. On the eve of the march, Lisa stood on the balcony of her quarters, the cold wind whipping her hair. The courtyard below was a sea of dark armor and disciplined soldiers. The sheer scale of David's power was breathtaking. "Are you ready?" She turned. David stood in the doorway, dressed in full battle armor. He looked like an ancient god of war, all dark metal, sharp edges, and predatory grace. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly, stepping off the balcony and into the room. David closed the door, shutting out the noise of the army below. He crossed the room, his armor clinking softly, and stopped in front of her. He reached up, his gloved hands gently cupping her face. "Fear is a survivor's instinct," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But you don't need to fear this. I am not taking you back to Sunridge to be a prisoner, Lisa. I am taking you back to watch Beatrice fall." "What happens after?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "When it's over and she's gone. What happens to me?" David stared at her, the golden intensity of his eyes stripping away every defense she had left. He slowly removed his right gauntlet, letting it drop to the floor with a heavy thud. He raised his bare hand, tracing the line of her collarbone with the pad of his thumb. The touch sent a jolt of fire straight to her core. "When it's over," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were barely a breath away from hers. "You will decide if you want to stay in the shadows or if you want to rule them." He kissed her, deep and claiming, a promise sealed not in blood or treaties, but in the undeniable, uncontrollable fire that raged between them. Tomorrow, they would bring down a queen. But tonight, the Alpha King bowed only to her. The Shadowpack army did not approach Sunridge under the cover of darkness. They marched at high noon, a massive, imposing tide of dark armor and disciplined wolves that blocked the main road. They moved with a terrifying silence, a stark contrast to the panicked chaos that erupted within the Sunridge borders as the warning bells began to toll. David rode at the head of the column, a massive black destrier beneath him, looking every inch the conqueror he was reputed to be. Lisa rode beside him, her spine straight, her chin high. She wore dark riding clothes, the colors of the Shadowpack, a silent declaration of her allegiance. When they reached the gates of the Sunridge estate, the local guards were already in disarray. They had expected an invading force. They hadn't expected the Alpha King himself, flanked by their banished daughter, demanding parley under the banner of pack justice. The gates opened slowly, whining in protest. Beatrice stood on the sweeping stone steps of the manor, flanked by her elite guard. She wore a gown of rich crimson, attempting to project regal authority. But her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously over the sheer size of the army at her door. David brought his horse to a halt 10 yards from the steps. The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute, thick with tension. "King David," Beatrice called out, her voice higher than usual, laced with false bravado. "This is a direct violation of our treaty. Your presence here is an act of war." "I am not here for war, Beatrice." David's voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls of the manor. It was the voice of a king passing judgment. "I am here for justice." He gestured to two of his warriors, who stepped forward and threw a heavy, blood-stained sack onto the ground at the foot of the steps. The contents spilled out. The severed heads of the rogue wolves that had attacked the fortress. Beatrice flinched, her crimson gown suddenly looking less like a symbol of power and more like a target. "We traced their scent markers," David continued, his voice cold and hard as iron. "They carried the specific blend of wolfsbane unique to your personal armory. You hired them to assassinate a member of my pack." "Lies!" Beatrice shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Lisa. "She is no member of your pack. She is a banished traitor, a tribute." "She is mine," David roared, the sheer force of his alpha aura washing over the courtyard. Several of the Sunridge guards stumbled backward, clutching their chests. Beatrice gasped, physically wilting under the oppressive weight of his dominance. David dismounted, his boots hitting the gravel with a heavy crunch. He walked toward the steps, his golden eyes locked onto Beatrice. "By pack law, an attack on a claimed mate is an attack on the alpha. You have committed treason, Beatrice. Not against Sunridge, but against me." The word hung in the air. "Mate." Lisa gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. He had claimed her before the emissary, but this was a formal declaration before two packs. It was an unbreakable bond, a challenge to the world. Beatrice looked frantically at her guards, but they were already lowering their weapons. They were loyal to the Sunridge pack, not to a corrupt leader who had just provoked the most dangerous alpha on the continent. They recognized a lost cause. "Arrest her," David commanded, not taking his eyes off the crumbling woman on the steps. Two Shadow Pack warriors moved forward, flanking Beatrice and binding her hands in heavy iron cuffs. She didn't fight. She seemed paralyzed by the sudden, absolute collapse of her power. David turned back to Lisa, his aura receding, leaving the courtyard breathing again. He walked over to her horse and reached up, his large hands gripping her waist, and lifted her down as effortlessly as if she weighed nothing. He didn't look at the defeated Beatrice or the surrendering Sunridge guards. He looked only at Lisa. The cold, ruthless king vanished, leaving only the man who had laid his empire at her feet. "The threat is gone," he said softly, his thumb brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "The choice is yours, Lisa. Sunridge is yours to claim, if you wish it. I will leave an occupying force to secure your rule." He was giving her everything. Her home, her revenge, her freedom. He was offering to walk away if that was what she truly wanted. Lisa looked at the grand manor where she had spent a lifetime feeling small, feeling unwanted. She looked at the Sunridge guards, who had stood by while she was banished. Then she looked at the man before her, the monster who had taught her how to fight, the king who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen. She reached up, her hands tangling in the thick hair at the nape of his neck. "Sunridge is a graveyard," she whispered, echoing the words he had spoken to her in the library. "I don't want it." David's breath hitched, a flicker of raw, undisguised hope igniting in his golden eyes. "Then what do you want?" Lisa smiled, a fierce, genuine smile that mirrored the fire he had awakened in her. "I want to go home, David. Take me back to the shadows." The feared Alpha King didn't smile. He didn't need to. The radiant, consuming heat in his eyes was answer enough. He crushed her to his chest, burying his face in her neck, holding her as if she were the only real thing in a world of ghosts. The army of the North erupted into a deafening roar of victory, not for a conquered territory, but for their king and the queen who had finally tamed him. The storm had passed, leaving behind a kingdom forever changed by a single, defiant tribute. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows with David and Lisa, please like this video, share it with your fellow romance readers, and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, heart-pounding stories. Let me know in the comments which scene was your favorite and what kind of alpha you'd like to see next.